The clock was inching toward midnight on New Year's Eve when the front door suddenly opened and my Uncle Graham walked in without any warning. He hadn't called, hadn't sent a message, and hadn't visited in years. Yet there he stood in a neatly pressed suit, his gaze sharp and restless. He scanned the room before fixing his eyes on me. "Ethan," he said firmly, "how is that $2.5 million trust fund I established for you 5 years ago?" I froze, my fork suspended halfway to my mouth. The laughter around the table vanished. Instantly. My heart pounded against my chest as I struggled to find words. Finally, I managed to stammer out the only response I could. "What trust fund? I've been working 3 jobs just to get by. I don't have a trust fund." The color seemed to drain from the room. My uncle's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as his eyes darted toward my parents. I followed his gaze, and in that moment, I saw something in my mother I had never noticed before. Her face turned ashen, and her hand shook against the edge of the table. My father's shoulders tensed, his eyes locked on his plate, avoiding everyone's stare. Uncle Graham's voice rose, thick with anger. "Don't tell me you never gave it to him. That money was his right. That money was meant to secure his future." My parents remained silent. Their quiet filled the room with a weight heavier than any words could. I sat there, stunned, my mind racing with questions I couldn't suppress. Why had I never heard of this? Why had I been struggling to survive if a fortune had been meant for me all along? And why did my parents look like their world was crumbling around them? My name is Ethan Calder. I'm 25 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I came from a working-class family that barely kept afloat. I grew up thinking that hard work was the only path to respect and that survival came from perseverance, not privilege. That belief shaped me, toughened me, and often left me wondering if my life would ever be more than a series of exhausting jobs and unpaid bills. When my uncle walked in, I was going through the toughest period of my life. I was juggling 3 jobs, each one wearing me down in different ways. During the day, I stood behind the counter of a convenience store, forcing a smile as customers rushed in for coffee and cigarettes. When my shift ended, I changed into the uniform of a delivery driver, navigating the city in an old car that rattled more than the radio. On nights when I could barely keep my eyes open, I dragged myself to handyman jobs patching drywall, fixing sinks in apartments that reeked of mildew. I did it all because I had no other option. Rent was always due, groceries always came with another bill I could barely afford, and even a simple doctor's visit was something I postponed, convincing myself I could endure the pain in my back or the headaches. Still, I tried to hold on to hope. I kept telling myself that one day, all this effort would pay off, that maybe I'd find a way to break free. My parents rarely discussed money. My mother, Lydia, always insisted we were fine, even when the fridge was nearly empty or when the power company's final notice slipped under our door. She told me every hardship was a lesson. Hard work builds character, she'd say again and again. She meant well, and I believed her because she was the one person who never stopped believing in me. My father, Marcus, was a man of few words. When he did speak, it was usually about responsibility and resilience. "Focus on getting through the week," he'd say when I complained about being tired. He worked long hours in construction, his hands rough and calloused from years of labor, but he rarely shared more than the basics of his day. I often wondered if he even noticed how hard I was working, or if he thought that was just how life was supposed to be. Despite the constant grind, I tried to keep the peace at home. My parents were all I had, and even when I was frustrated, I convinced myself that someday I'd make them proud. That belief kept me going through nights when my body wanted to give up. I thought we were a team, facing the world together. I had no idea that beneath the surface, there were secrets none of them dared to tell me. New Year's Eve should have been a celebration. That night, we sat around a small wooden table in our living room wearing the flimsy paper hats my mom had bought from a discount store. She had prepared a modest dinner of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, stretching every dollar as she always did. A bottle of cheap champagne sat unopened on the counter, waiting for midnight. I glanced at the clock and then at my phone. My friends were posting pictures of glamorous parties, downtown open bars, sparkling dresses, and confetti. I felt a pang of envy, but quickly pushed it aside. This was my family, and though it was simple, I told myself it was enough. As I sat there, I studied my parents. My mother smiled, trying to keep the mood light, but her eyes betrayed a heaviness that had been growing for years. My father was quiet as usual, cutting his chicken with slow, deliberate movements. I wondered if he even noticed how different our lives were from those around us, or if he had accepted that this was simply our place in the world. I remember raising my glass of soda and saying, "Here's to a better year. Maybe this one will finally bring some stability." My mother smiled faintly and clinked her glass against mine. My father nodded but said nothing. For a moment, I felt the sting of silence, the kind that reminds you how much you want to be heard but never are. I pushed the feeling down and reminded myself to be grateful. At least I had them. At least I wasn't spending the night alone. At least there was food on the table, however modest. That was the story I told myself, the story that kept me from resenting the long hours and the constant struggle. But as I sat there watching the seconds tick closer to midnight, I couldn't have imagined that everything I believed about my family was about to shatter. I thought the year ahead might bring better luck, maybe even a chance at stability. Instead, it brought a revelation so powerful that it tore apart every assumption I had built my life on. The sound of the front door opening on New Year's Eve startled all of us. We weren't expecting anyone. I turned in my chair and saw a tall figure step inside without hesitation, as if he owned the place. My breath caught when I realized it was my Uncle Graham. I hadn't seen him in years. He was my father's older brother, though I had never felt close to him. Where my father looked worn down by years of labor, Graham always carried himself with a sharpness that made people uneasy. He wore a tailored suit, even on a holiday night, and his silver hair was neatly combed back. His presence filled the small living room instantly, pushing out whatever warmth we had managed to hold on to during dinner. "Happy New Year," he said flatly, his voice carrying both authority and judgment. His eyes scanned the room before settling on me. Then, without a smile or any small talk, he leaned slightly forward and spoke the words that stopped my world. "So, Ethan, how's that $2.5 million trust fund treating you?" I blinked, certain I had misheard him. My fork clattered against my plate. The room went silent, so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My mouth went dry, but somehow I forced out words. "What trust fund?" "I've been working 3 jobs just to get by. I don't have a trust fund." "For?" A moment, Graham's face didn't move, as if he was measuring my sincerity. Then his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and a flash of anger sparked in his expression. He turned his head toward my parents, and in that single movement, the atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to something darker. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising with controlled fury. "You mean to tell me you never told him? You kept everything from him." My mother froze, her hands trembling against the tablecloth, her face pale as she stared down at her plate as though it could shield her from the storm. My father didn't lift his eyes at all. He cut his chicken slowly, mechanically, refusing to acknowledge the words that had just been spoken. I looked at them both, my heart hammering. "Mom, Dad, what is he talking about?" Neither of them answered. My mother opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, shaking her head slightly. My father cleared his throat, but no words came. Graham's voice cut through the silence like a blade. 5 years ago, I set up a trust fund for Ethan. $2.5 million. It was his inheritance, his future. And you mean to tell me you let him break his back for scraps while you hid it from him? I stared at my parents in disbelief. Is this true? You knew about this? You knew and said nothing. While I worked nights and slept in my car between shifts? My mother whispered, Ethan, please. But her voice broke and faded away. My father still refused to look at me. His silence was louder than any words. Anger surged in my chest, flooding through me in a way I had never felt before. I slammed my hands against the table. Answer me. Is it true? Finally, my father lifted his eyes, but only to glare at his brother. This isn't your business, Graham. Not my business? Graham roared. This is my nephew's life. This is his birthright, and you've buried it under your lies. The tension in the room grew unbearable. I could barely breathe. Questions raced through my mind faster than I could process them. Why had I never been told? What were they hiding? What could possibly justify letting me suffer when there was money meant to give me a future? I turned to my mother, desperate for the truth. Why? Why didn't you ever tell me? Tears welled in her eyes. She reached across the table toward my hand, but I pulled back. Her voice cracked as she whispered, We thought it was better this way. Better? I shouted. You thought it was better for me to think I had nothing, to believe I had to fight every single day just to survive while you hid a fortune that was mine? My uncle slammed his fist against the table, rattling the dishes. Enough. He deserves to know everything. You can't keep hiding this. Not anymore. My father's face hardened. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes darkened with anger. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his expression, too. He had always been a quiet man, and now he looked cornered. I could feel the air in the room thick with unspoken words, my uncle's fury, my mother's guilt, my father's silence. It all built into a storm that was about to break. I pushed back my chair, standing up so quickly it nearly toppled over. I'm not a child anymore. Stop protecting me. Stop lying to me. Tell me the truth. My chest rose and fell as if I had run a marathon. But I wouldn't back down. I had spent my life staying quiet, working hard, accepting scraps while believing that was my destiny. Not anymore. My uncle rose to his feet as well, towering over the table, his voice thunderous. He's right. He's old enough, and you can't keep him in the dark any longer. The truth will come out tonight. My parents sat frozen, pale, and trembling. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall, each second stretching into eternity. I knew something irreversible was about to be revealed, something that would tear apart the only life I had ever known. The air in the room felt suffocating. My Uncle Graham's words still echoed like a hammer striking steel, and my parents sat in silence, trembling under the weight of his accusations. I stood at the edge of the table, fists clenched, heart racing, my voice raw from demanding the truth. I could no longer sit still. For years I had obeyed their lessons, believing every word they told me about hard work, sacrifice, and humility. I had convinced myself that my exhaustion was noble, that the blisters on my hands and the bags under my eyes were proof I was building character. Yet here I stood, suddenly confronted with evidence that my entire life had been built on deception. The people I trusted most had kept me in the dark. I took a step toward them. I want answers. Not later, not tomorrow, right now. You let me break myself for years while you watched. You owe me the truth. My mother shook her head as tears rolled down her cheeks. Ethan, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. This is not the way you should find out. Find out what? I shouted. That my life could have been different? That I didn't have to sleep in my car between shifts? That I didn't have to eat ramen every night while a fortune was sitting somewhere with my name on it? What else have you been keeping from me? My father finally looked up at me. His eyes were cold, his jaw stiff. You are my son. That is what matters. I gave you a roof. I gave you food. I taught you what it means to fight for survival. I felt anger boil in my chest. You gave me silence. You gave me lies. That's what you gave me. Graham stepped closer to me, his hand firm on my shoulder. You are right to demand answers. You have been treated unfairly. I will not stand by while they keep burying the truth. My father glared at him. Stay out of this, Graham. You've meddled enough. This is our family, not yours. But Graham refused to back down. He is Daniel's son, not yours, Marcus, and you know it. The words hit me like a punch, but I refused to collapse. I steadied myself, refusing to let them keep control of my life any longer. My mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, as if Graham had ripped away the last layer of protection she had tried to build around me. I turned back to her. Is that true? Is that what this is about? Tell me who I am. Tell me who my father is. She reached for me again, her voice cracking with desperation. Ethan, please listen. We were only trying to protect you. We wanted you to have a normal life. We thought if we kept it from you, you would be safe. Safe from what? I demanded. My voice shook, but it carried more force than I had ever felt. Safe from knowing the truth? Safe from my own life? You say you wanted me to be normal, but nothing about this is normal. You watched me fall apart while you kept secrets that could have changed everything. That is not protection. That is betrayal. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother collapse under the weight of her own guilt. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. My father sat stiff and silent, refusing to give me the answers I needed, his pride keeping him chained to his lies. I straightened my back and drew in a deep breath. My voice lowered but grew sharper, steadier. You don't get to decide what I know anymore. You don't get to keep me in the dark. Tonight I want the truth, all of it, no more excuses. Graham nodded firmly beside me. He is right. You had your chance to explain. Now he deserves to hear what has been hidden for far too long. My father slammed his hand against the table, rattling the dishes. You think you know what is best for him, Graham, but you don't. You never did. You come in here with your money and your lectures, acting like you care. But where were you all these years? I was honoring Daniel's wishes, Graham snapped. I gave him a future that you stole. You took his legacy and buried it. And for what? To keep control? To hide your shame? Their voices rose, clashing like thunder. But I no longer felt like a bystander. I no longer felt like the quiet son who nodded and obeyed. This was my life. They were arguing over my future. They had stolen from me. And I would not be silenced. I slammed my fist down harder than both of them, the sound cutting through their shouting. Enough. You can argue about who was right or wrong. But this is my life. I'm the one who lived it, not you. So I am telling you now, I will not leave this room until I know everything. The room fell silent again. My mother's sobs slowed into quiet gasps. My father's chest heaved with anger, but he said nothing. Graham stared at me with approval, as if he saw a strength in me that had been buried under years of silence and obedience. I stood there, unshaken. For the first time in my life, I felt in control. My words carried weight. My demand for the truth could no longer be ignored. I had made my choice. I would face whatever came next, no matter how painful it was. Graham's eyes locked on mine. Then you should hear it from me. Tonight you will finally know who you really are. My pulse quickened. Every nerve in my body braced for the truth that was about to change my life forever. The room felt frozen in time, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Graham's voice broke the stillness, steady and sharp. Ethan deserves the truth. He has lived his whole life carrying a weight that was never his to bear. Tonight he learns who he really is. My chest tightened. I gripped the back of my chair to steady myself, bracing for words that I knew would change me forever. My mother's shoulders shook, and she whispered through her tears, "Please, Graham, don't." He ignored her plea. His eyes never left mine. "Ethan, Marcus is not your biological father." The words struck with the force of a hammer. My knees weakened, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. Every memory of my childhood, every lesson, every stern glance, every struggle suddenly twisted into something unfamiliar. I turned to my father, or the man I thought was my father, searching his face for denial, for anger, for anything to suggest this wasn't real. But Marcus sat stone still, refusing to argue. His silence confirmed everything. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. "You're saying the man who raised me isn't my father?" Graham stepped closer, his voice firm. "Your real father was my brother, Daniel. He was a good man, Ethan. He loved you before you were even born. He wanted to give you everything he never had." My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The name sounded distant and familiar all at once, like a shadow I had always known but never understood. "Daniel," I whispered. "Why have I never heard about him?" My mother finally lifted her face, her eyes red and swollen. Her voice shook as she tried to explain, "Because Daniel died before you were old enough to know him. He was your father, Ethan. He was the love of my life. But after his accident, I married Marcus because he promised to raise you as his own. I thought it was the best way to give you a stable family." I staggered back as the truth unraveled. My chest burned with betrayal. "You lied to me my entire life. You made me believe Marcus was my father while you hid the truth about the man who actually was." My father's voice finally cut through, deep and unyielding. "I raised you, Ethan. Blood doesn't change that. I put food on the table. I gave you discipline. I kept you alive." I snapped, my voice raw with anger. "You kept me alive, but you also kept me blind. You let me believe a false story about myself while I struggled every day. And all the while, there was a trust fund waiting for me, money my real father left me. You let me suffer while you buried his legacy." My uncle's face burned with fury as he pointed directly at Marcus. "You robbed him of his inheritance. That money was meant to give him a life Daniel dreamed for him. You let him scrape and bleed for years while you sat in silence." Marcus's face hardened, but his eyes flickered with guilt. He needed to learn the value of hard work. Money makes people soft. I wasn't going to raise a spoiled boy. "Hard work?" I shouted. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "I've worked myself into the ground. I've lost sleep. I've skipped meals. I've missed out on life because I thought I had no choice. And all this time, you let me break myself down while you kept his gift locked away. That wasn't teaching me a lesson. That was cruelty." My mother reached for me, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We thought we were protecting you from disappointment. We thought if you grew up without knowing about the money, you would learn strength. We thought it was the only way." I pulled away, my throat raw. "Protecting me? You didn't protect me. You stole from me. You stole my chance to know who I really was. You stole my right to know my father." Graham's voice softened, though his anger still burned. "Daniel loved you, Ethan. He told me to make sure you had everything you needed. That trust fund was his promise to you. He wanted you to grow into the man he knew you could be. And I will not let that promise be buried any longer." I looked at Marcus, the man who had raised me, the man I had called father all my life. Why? Why would you do this to me? Was it jealousy? Was it control? Did you ever even love me? His face twisted with pain, but his words were steady. "I raised you as my own." That was love, Ethan. Maybe I made mistakes, but everything I did to keep you strong. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. You kept me strong by breaking me. You kept me blind so you could play the role you wanted. You never gave me a choice. The truth stood in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. My real father was gone. My inheritance had been hidden. The man I trusted most had built my life on lies. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me, leaving nothing but free fall. Yet in that moment, I also felt something else, resolve. The truth was mine now. No more silence, no more secrets. I was no longer the obedient son who accepted hardship without question. I was Daniel's son, and his legacy would no longer be denied. As fireworks exploded outside, rattling the windows with bursts of light, I stood taller. My life had just been torn apart, but I knew this was the night it would finally begin. The fireworks outside roared through the night sky, but inside that small living room, the celebration felt hollow. My life had just been broken open. I stood in the same house I had always known, surrounded by the same people I had always called family. Yet nothing felt familiar anymore. My hands trembled as the truth settled deeper into my chest. Daniel was my father. He had left me a future, and the people who should have loved me enough to tell me had chosen silence instead. I sat down heavily in the chair I had pushed away minutes before. My legs felt weak, my chest tight. My mother reached for me again, but I pulled back. I wasn't ready for comfort, not from her, not when her silence had cost me so much. She lowered her hand slowly, tears spilling freely down her face. I could tell she wanted to explain, to soothe, to hold me the way she did when I was a child. But the distance between us was too wide. Now my father knew. Marcus sat across from me. He wasn't crying. He rarely showed